the mid-19th century, the town of Gainsborough had reached new heights in prosperity. This thriving market town established itself as a leading inland port, and industries within an industry flourished. Shipbuilding, customs and excise, wharfs and warehouses, basket making and rope works, trade and cargo, carriers and pleasure cruising. Then came the railways. The town that commanded 2 railway stations could not comprehend that something such as the railway would eventually send Gainsborough's chief industries into decline and extinction. But in true Phoenix fashion, out of the ashes of one industry emerged the birth and growth of new industries. In 1848, Marshall's Engineering Company was found. Henry Marshall describes its early innovations.
Was my great-grandfather, William Marshall, and he'd been William Fairburn's representative. William Fairburn, a firm of milling machine makers in Manchester, and he'd been their representative in Russia, and he'd been at St. Petersburg. That's where his depot was. But he hailed from Gainsborough originally, and when he came back, there are various suggestions of how long he was out there, but I think it goes from 6 to 16 years, but I think nearer 16 than 6. When he came back in 1848, he went home to Gainsborough, and they were just building the railway. It had all been river traffic before then. It was a great river port, Gainsborough was, and they were building the railway, which was going to take away the river trade, and he thought it was a good place to build start a factory of engineering with having the river and the railway, and they'd a certain amount of roads, but they were very primitive in those days, the roads. Anyhow, he got started. He acquired the business of an old millwright in North Street, and he got started working, and from there he built up until he was building up when he died in about 1863 or 4 when he died, and his sons James and Henry took on.
In 1850, the inhabitants of Gainsborough numbered less than 7,000. However, by the turn of the century, this figure had risen by over 10,000. A large majority of the town's inhabitants resided in the yards. In fact, Gainsborough, above any other town, had the largest quantity of yards in proportion to its population. Nellie was born in a yard known as Paddock, off Pleasance Place, Bridge Street, just after the turn of the century. Later, she went on to live in Casket Street. Nellie recalls a particular fond memory from her childhood days.
I went shopping for my mum, and I've got walking down that street. I didn't know that photo was getting took. There was my Strabon's shop, and then there's that empty shop there. And you go along and get down to Casket Street. No, I didn't know it was getting took. No, I was just walking along and I didn't know. And then when I went in somewhere, I think it was a building society, I seen my photo there.
Now let's take an imaginary walk down what was once one of Gainsborough's most ancient streets.
We're at the corner of Casket Street, opposite what used to be the Woolpack Hotel. The Woolpack Hotel was slightly to the right of Casket Street on the corner, and next to that was the Red Hall, and onto that was the Packet Landing leading up to the river. Years ago, people used to stay at the Woolpack Hotel. In the last century, it was £0.50 a night to stay there, and then people would get the steam packet up to Hull. Years ago, it was all small cobblestones, as many of you will remember. And on the left is the new Guildhall as now, and then next we come to Ellsworth Hall, a very old Georgian building with deeds dating back to 1722. But years ago, there must have been a lot more different buildings down here, even before Ellsworth Hall, as Casket Street looks right onto the old hall in the background. It was called Casgate or Castlegate. Years ago as well, opposite when there were buildings and old yards, there was also the Smith's Wig Factory, which is now based in Tower Street. We're now looking in the opposite direction, coming down the other way from Casket Street, looking towards the old hall. As the at the corner was the other side of the wool pack, and next to them were little yards. One of them, quite well known, had a pump in the middle of it. Then coming a little bit further up, just past Ellsworth Hall, and we have the Red Cross. Before the Red Cross, it was a pub called the Newcastle Arms. Let's not forget that there was no main road there then. Casket Street was a little narrow lane, and you couldn't see the river at all. There was nothing at all there, apart from buildings and old malkins. So, standing here now outside Ellsworth Hall, really, and looking over there at the rowing club as we see it now, it's very hard for people to visualise, really, that it was all in one little narrow lane.
Well, the entrance was very narrow. On the right-hand side, there was the pub. And a little bit past the pub, there was about 2 little houses. Of course, the council offices was on your left-hand side, but not these council offices, what you see now. And you could go round the back, and there was the back of the fire station, where they used to dry the hoses, behind the doctors. Of course, the doctors was still there, Ellsworth House, of course. Opposite then there was a little yard, where Rogerses lived in it, Robinsons lived in it, Pierces lived in it. There was a pump in the middle, and I had one gas lamp on that top. On the, on the bracket lamp it was. It used to shine in on Hattifer Wakes corner, as a matter of fact. Then I used to plod on down there, and I used to have to branch off to the left, and I used to go into shipping yard, not Shipcote, shipping yard. And I used to have a gas lamp on the bracket lamp on shipping wall.
You seem to be nearly straight until you sort of came opposite Shipcote, and then that's when you got the very S-bend turn right at the very end of Casket Street, and then it curved right round, and on the left there was the old Congregational Chapel, which in later years that became the cinema. The old Grand, as people knew it, and then when that closed, the Grand opened up in the marketplace. The old Casket Street we remember is gone, and just in front of us, here is where we could come out as well. There was 2 ways out of Casket Street. You could get out at Shipcote Way, and you could also get out just at this corner, and you came into Silver Street. There was no through road like there is today, but you just came round the narrow bend right at the very end and into Silver Street. But a lot of people would rather take the Shipcote one, because if we came into right round the bend and into Silver Street, would it been so narrow and so dark, and it was so badly lit, a lot of people didn't like taking the other end that eventually curved round opposite White Horse.
In the little spare time the busy people of Gainsborough had, they made their own entertainment. Les Roberts, who was once a town gas lamp lighter, recalls a story told to him by his parents.
I remember my mum telling me that when she was a young lass, baby in a pram, my grandmother wheeled her across the Trent when it was frozen over to go visit my people at missed it.
And I mean, if you walked on Trinity Street on a Friday night, it would be the Britannia band playing in the canteen. I mean, we've had bands in the marketplace, RAF band, Britannia band, you name it, Salvation Army band. Every Saturday the Salvation Army was there, and 3 times on a Sunday the Army was out then. But the trouble today is you see people have cars and they don't march like they used to do, so you don't see them. The only thing I can remember when, well, I suppose I was getting towards the end of leaving school, there was a lady in Casket Street and she used to hire bikes out for £1 a day, and we used to go and hire a bike, and that's the only time I ever remember going out of town, except on the trips from the central station, Cleethorpes 2 and 6.
And there were the many fairs and carnivals.
I remember the fairs we used to have on Levellings. And I mean the Levellings fairs then used to stretch a long way. Full there was. I remember going across there on our way to school, to Roper, when I moved to Roper.
Oh, the court galas. Oh, I remember the court galas. Every child in Gainsborough nearly was on them. There used to be all the coal carts and horses, because in them days it was all carts and horses. It was all decorated up. All the Lee Road and all that, and children we used to have, there was all lined up in the full length of Trent Street, the full length of Waterworks Street, all horses, all decorated. And all the children from all this end of town got on all these lorries, all these horse and carts, and we all went up to Plymouth. And there must have been thousands of them. And when you got up there, all the races were organised. There was thousands of children. It had all been organised by the co-op. You all raced, and there was entertainment. There was one of Marshall's boilers up there boiling water. Every child was given a hold all, what do you call them? satchel things like, and in it was a bit of currant cake and sandwiches and that, and the sandwiches tasted of the cake, and the cake tasted of the sandwiches. There would be an orange and an apple and 3 cups of tea. Oh, it was a wonderful day. The only snag to it was you used to have to walk home. And if you lived on Lee Road, well, we did, it was a hell of a walk back from up on there, because it was just outside the hall, all the racing going on. All day long there was entertainment and fun. Just one day a year, what we used to call Stewart's Gala.
By 1900, Gainsborough was at the forefront of the precision engineering trade. Sid Archer, a retired Marshall's employee, recalls what made Gainsborough's firms unique.
The people I learnt my trade under were craftsmen like, they were geniuses like. There was no such thing as machinery to make anything like, you know, they made it out of the raw metal and that. And they were brilliant men, brilliant craftsmen, not treated very well like, but they were brilliant men. And I mean, people like me and well, hundreds and hundreds like us, like we learnt we trade under such people like. And there was thousands of tradesmen turned out in Gainsborough could, you know, they could command a job anywhere. In fact, they were sought after, the type of persons that Gainsborough turned out, whatever the trade was.
It started about, I should think it started about just before the turn of the century. I should say it started about 1898, the Fire Brigade, and it consisted of all volunteers who worked on the firm. There would be about 25 in the Fire Brigade, and the proprietors of the company bought them a fire engine, and of course it was horses in those days, and a fire engine. And they kept the Fire Brigade intact until about 1900, I should think it would be about 1965 when they became defunct, and they switched on to the town Fire Brigade then. My grandfather started it because he thought that people were being filched with large rents, people charging the marshal's employees large rents for their houses, which he considered was unfair. So he started the Building Society, and it's on the go today. I'm still a director of the Building Society. In 1914, there were 5,000 men working at Marshall's, and the war came in 1914, and 2,500 of them went off, and they introduced 2,500 of ladies into Marshall's, and they still got 5,000, but half of them were ladies, and very creditably they worked too right through the war.
They was practising crossing water, and Sir Hickman Bacon had offered them the lake at Thunnock, and for some reason they refused it, and they went to this, and there's a lot of trouble in here about the inquest, like, you know, and we're talking about what, 70, 80 years ago now, but it's all in here. Astonishing, look, that the place should have been used for such a purpose. Because it's supposed to be bottomless, wasn't it, the guy? They're supposed to be bottomless, these. Well, what happened, there was practicing going across and it tipped over.
Long after the Great War, to which Walter Kelsey fought on the Somme, he and his good friend Harold Brace became involved in another of Gainsborough's mysteries.
We knew about these tunnels. I told Harold about a tunnel that used to be on Packet Landing, what was Chapel Stay, Packet Landing, when I was at Rose's. And during the First World War there was a lot of petrol stored down there, in petrol tins. And if you come into the Second World War, they wanted to do some extension, and also they wanted petrol and that sort of thing, and these tins had rotted and the petrol had gone, and they had to do a hell of a job. They got a fire engine, Rose's fire engine, and took luckily the petrol had, and it was fumes all over there, striking like shrinking down. And they used to keep a little runabout trolley in that tunnel. Network of tunnels, and there was a connection at one time, and we can't find, from the old hall, but I have an idea. We never been able to find the entrance at the old hall side, but I reckon the cenotaph is built on it. It goes across there somewhere.
The exact magnitude of Gainsborough's network of tunnels was brought home when the town decided to honour its war dead with the building of a cenotaph in the grounds of the old hall. Sid Archer remembers something curious happened.
We had to build it over a tunnel, and it gave way.
Walter remembers the hallmarks of old Gainsborough.
But it was intended to be a small market town of 12,000, built in the shape of a cross, and a Georgian town. Market Street, and the market was built in the early 1700s. Lord Street. And there was narrow streets, there was cobble, and there was half bay windows with thick glass, small panes, all over.
town had begun to grow from its original formation as Gainsborough's population swelled. Sid Archer was born and grew up at the south end of the town, close to where once stood the workhouse.
My father always used to say, you know, you went far to go if what was wrong, boy. Oh, aye. And at the workhouse there was a bell, and it used to go every night at 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock at night. And all us children all had to be in the house by then. When that bell went, if you was, you know, you used to run home like. Yeah. And all the time there, round our area at night, the tramps, used to call them tramps, used to come, get there roughly about just before 6 o'clock at night, and they'd come round with the billy cans and asking for hot water to make tea and that.
The extent of Gainsborough's growth can be measured by the fact that during the mid-19th century, when the cholera epidemics came to the town via the river and ran rife through the many yards, there is evidence to suggest the dead were gathered and transported to the outskirts, now Lee Village, and buried in mass graves, which Sid Archer refers to here with his story about the plague.
Because that field there, you know, there's a lot of controversy. Years ago, for years it stood a big notice up there, this is the site for the Cavendish Arms. They was going to build a big hotel there, but it got stopped, and you know, you hear what the talk is about it being an ancient burial ground of the plague, the overspill. That's why they say it's never been built on.
But what is remembered about the many yards, above all else, is the strong feeling of friendship and goodwill that existed within the stark reality of day-to-day living.
6 little houses in a row stood in a yard long ago. They stood across from the railway track, and the windows shut when the trains came back. First Mrs. Jones, then us and Mrs. Johnson too. Mrs. Ball ate chocolate and read books through.
We used
Mrs.
to
Barber
dolly
didn't
pegs
like
and
to lend. Mrs.
dolly
Carroll
touch them.
sat at the end.
We did. And wash, you know, scoop tubs and all of that. Didn't used to have these fancy things. And we used to have a mandle that went round, you know, and we used to mandle it, the clothes.
Oh, how I remember the old tin bath a-hanging on the wall. We hung ours up on Cellar Head now, I recall. By gum, it weren't half grand getting bathed in front of the fire. But once my mam built it up too much, it chimney caught on fire. And my mam always bathed the little uns first, and them two weren't half lucky, 'cause by the time it got to me, the water wasn't half mucky. She'd round next lot up like
people all had tin baths. And I mean, you could tell when on the days when it was washed there, because people didn't wash every day of the week. It was usually Monday, and you could see the steam and that coming out of the wash houses. Oh yeah. And if it was sunny, a lot used to do the washing out in the yard, you know, with the old dolly legs and massive ringers.
Them 6 little houses in a row, they've been knocked down some years ago. Where are the folk? Where can they be? I wonder if they remember me.
And there was another thing that used to go on in the town, and I can only just remember it, but there will be a lot of people who will remember it. We used to call it, or it was called, robbing dinners. And it was for people whose fathers were out of work, and had been out of work a long while, like. And they used to go and go to the hall and get a good square meal, real good square meal, and then go to the grand cinema and show them a film and give them a present. It was known as the robbing dinner.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The Second World War affected Gainsborough in a way the war affected most towns. This daily cash book of Benny Lane, who ran the butcher's shop close to the Pillars on Bridge Street, records all orders between the years 1928 to 1954. As the war begins to affect Gainsborough, we can see orders becoming rationed. Even Benny Lane's handwriting, who was a giant of a man, becomes smaller, neater and concise in order to economise. Sacrifices in many forms had to be made as the war progressed. Sid Archer recalls vivid memories of Gainsborough being bombed whilst working in Marshall's.
Well, when they dropped the bombs on Gainsborough, I was in Marshall's, and Bill says, God, I don't like the sound of that. He said, it's either one of ours coming home lame or it's one of theirs. God, Pat, he'd no sooner said that than the, oh dear. They started to come down like, and I counted them, and there was 5 dropped, and the 5th dropped, which I saw later, on Everett's Cafe, as was. It's now the YEB. And we went across, and the old Peacock pub, as was, all that was left of it was the floor of the bedroom. And it was hung like that, you know, and stood on it was a lady, never forget it, never as long as I live, in a night dress. And I went to her because she didn't know which way to turn. There was people screaming and shouting and going. And I just went up and I said, I'll have you down in a minute, love. And she said, don't worry about me, young man. There's no end under there. Leave me, I'm all right. I'll never forget. What an heroic thing to say for a woman, wasn't it? Stood there. Because that's all that was left of Peacock. And of course I turned and there was Everett's Cafe in one great heap.
But many people are perhaps still unfamiliar with the enormous contribution Gainsborough's firms made to the war effort, such as Rose's redesigned twin-gun turret and Marshall's Midget-X submarine.
Bomber Harris has said here, in his book, he quotes, I saw something would have to be done, and done quickly, and I discovered a typical old English family firm. It took Rose's no more than a fortnight to produce designs for gun mountings which got rid of all the fearful disabilities of the official type, doubled the effective power of the Hamden, and eliminated all the blind spots, and in a few weeks gun mountings were in full production and going into action. Well, the midget submarines was built in Gainsborough, and they was built in what we used to call in Marshall's number 1 yard, and they was built all hush-hush, you know, it was all boarded up, nobody could see this submarine being built. It was built, obviously the hull and all that was built in the boiler shop, which was up on Sansfield Lane, and then when the hull was finished, it was brought down to what we call number 1 yard, and some of the corners of Colville Terrace and all that was knocked down to get the submarine round and back into number 1 yard, and of course they were built in Marshall.
Now tomorrow night you do not move out this house, I'll tell you that. Do you hear?
No, she's not going out.
She does not move out this house, parading the blooming streets like that.
Cyril Cook was born and bred in Gainsborough. He was a founder member of the Gainsborough Reminiscence Project, which produced many town-based plays as the old stagers. It was this group of people that later went on to form the Delvers.
Have you heard? The war is over! Just leaving Bombay, bound for old Blighty shore, heavily laden with time expired men.
Shortly after the war were terrible snowstorms in Gainsborough, but the snow is not what people remember most about that winter of 1947.
It was at about March, I think it started. Yeah, it was terrible that for people. Because, I mean, I don't know, water, I think it is the worst thing you can ever have. I think even in some places, under the paper, I think there's still the marks where that water went in some of the houses. But, I mean, when you got Willoughby Street, it was very deep in Willoughby Street, nearly up to the bedroom windows in the middle, because it used to dip and rise. And I'd been to my aunt's. When I was coming back, I got home and I says to my mother, I said, blooming heck, I said, there's water coming down Tooley Street, you know how it slopes, and it was coming out the grate. Not from over the river, and it was like cascading up. Anyhow, she said, well, you better go back and see how your aunt is. Like, anyhow, when I got back, I couldn't get down there, could I? And of course, I remember the ducks flying about. You know what I mean when I say ducks? Army vehicles going round taking stuff to them and fetching them off, and bringing some people that wanted to leave out, like to these rest centres that are set up in the town.
Gainsborough grew up along the banks of its river and remained virtually unchanged for centuries. The river was eventually replaced by the railways, and the railways were eventually replaced by road transport. The narrow roads and cobbled streets were therefore deemed unsuitable, and in the name of modernisation, the rows and rows of yards came tottering down too. The face of Gainsborough was to change virtually beyond recognition.
Oh, how I love this grand old town, the place where I was born. The country lane is not far away, and fields of waving corn. But memories are all I have of things that I hold dear. On Sunday after church we'd go over the bridge if fine. We'd sit on the 8 arches, and with voices loud and clear, we'd have a lovely sing-along, singing songs of yesteryear.
Although these words have a modern relevance, I am sure it will surprise many of you to know that this verse was written nearly 150 years ago, when Thomas Miller recalled his Gainsborough being ruined by the arrival of the railways. The meaning, of course, is crystal clear. Each generation treasures different memories to that of their predecessors. The past is always, always ever glowing for those of us lucky enough to have lived and experienced it. But it is tomorrow that matters, for without our tomorrow